So what you're seeing right now is the absolute lowest setting my lens will go to for my aperture, and that's giving me this nice, creamy, smooth looking background. I'm in focus, everything behind me is out of focus. And in this video, I'm gonna show you how you can do that on your camera and your lens as well. Welcome back to another video here on Cinematic Diaries, and yes, today I'm going to show you how you can get this nice, creamy, smooth looking, blurry background in your videos as well. So what is this technically called? Like the blurry background, that's what you might call it. Another name for it is bokeh or bokeh, I don't know how you pronounce that, or even shallow depth of field. And I believe the professional term for this is aperture. Now your aperture is set in your lens. The aperture is part of the three main settings for exposure. So you've got your aperture, you've got your ISO, and then you've got your shutter speed. So anytime you go to take a photo in manual mode or shoot video in manual mode, you're gonna have to set those three to whatever your liking is in order to get the shot exposure that you want. Another way to explain aperture, to understand it, is basically in your lens, like I said, this is where your aperture is controlled. There's small tiny gears and mechanics inside that lens. There's a piece that opens and closes to let more light in or to decrease the light that comes in. And it's very similar to the pupil in your eye. If you think about it, when your pupils dilate, it's trying to get more light in. So if you've ever gone into a dark room before, you're trying to see, your pupils are dilating so they can let more light in. However, if you go out in the sunlight, they're gonna contract, and they're trying to prevent more light coming in, right? We don't really have much control over that. It's kind of set to auto for us, but that's essentially another way to understand what aperture is and how it functions. If your aperture is wide open, all the way open, it's gonna let the most light in, and that's gonna give you that blurry background. And then your subject is going to be the one that's in focus. Everything behind it is going to be out of focus. Now, how do we control our aperture in our lens on our camera body? Another name for this is f-stop. You've probably seen that in a part of your camera settings. You'll probably see on the camera a lowercase f / a certain number. And for some lenses, it ranges from 1.4, 1.2, those are really wide apertures, all the way up to f16. The larger that number is, the smaller your aperture is going to be. I know it can be a little confusing at first, but once you really start to think about it and you understand it, you'll get it eventually. So higher f-stop means a smaller aperture, so less light is getting in. However, a lower f-stop number, such as 1.4, which is what I'm shooting on right now, that's going to be a wider aperture, bigger and smaller. You'll figure it out. I'm gonna pop up a chart here to give you a pretty clear understanding just how aperture and f-stop works. If you take a look here, on our left side, we've got f-stop 1.4. That's the lowest setting, so that's what you're seeing right now. I've got my camera set up to f-stop 1.4. And so that's gonna be a very large aperture. My aperture is very wide open right now. It's letting the maximum amount of light that this lens can let in. That's what it's doing. And so there's gonna be a very small depth of field, right? And so what that means is I'm in focus right here. A very small portion of the shot is gonna be in focus, and the camera is finding my face because it's got great eye auto detection in the A7 III. Great job, A7 III. And it's putting me in focus instead of like the light back there. And in addition to that, that's the brightest it's gonna get. The aperture can't allow any more light in, right? And so you're gonna have to adjust your settings accordingly. And then if you look to the next one, f-stop 2.8, it's a large aperture, still a small depth of field. I usually shoot in f-stop 2.8, little in focus, and it's still pretty bright. And then so on and so forth, all the way up to say f-stop 22. My lens doesn't go up that far, it goes up to f-stop 16. And so that aperture is very, very small. And so there's a very small amount of light being let in. So that's gonna be a large depth of field. If you think about it, a large depth of field means there's a lot that's in focus. So if you go out to shoot like a mountain, you're gonna want your f-stop at a much higher setting so that more is in focus. Because if it's at like f-stop 1.8, you might get that tree off in the corner, 300 yards away instead of the mountain. In addition to that, it's gonna be the darkest, okay? So another tip to know is if you go shoot out in midday and you don't have an ND filter, you're probably gonna have to have your f-stop all the way up to the highest settings, and then your ISO probably at 100, I would say. That's usually what I have to do if I don't have my ND filter. So if you think about it, the more light you get, the more of that blurry, creamy background you're going to get as well. However, you are going to have to adjust adjust those other settings to set your exposure, because it is going to change your exposure. Let me show you for example here. So we're set to f-stop 1.4. So I'm in focus right now. As you can see, everything in the background is pretty blurry. Let's just go up to f-stop 7.1. As you can tell, I became incredibly dark. So now I've got to adjust for that. I've got to increase my light. So I've just decreased the amount of light that I'm letting into my lens. And so now I'm gonna have to adjust my ISO. So we'll just bump my ISO up to say 3200, right? Now look at the background. The background's not as blurry as it was before. You see what it does there. Another rule of thumb is you're gonna want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate. Most cameras, probably right now, you might be shooting in 24 frames a second. I'm shooting in 24 frames a second, okay? And so that's what most films are shot on anyways. And so that gives us that natural motion blur, makes it look the most realistic. That's camera science that's kind of above my pay grade, above my understanding. If you want to know more about that, go research that. But I do understand double your frame rate, so double 24 is 50. So right now my shutter speed is 1/50. If I were to do 30 frames a second, it would be 1/60. And then for a lot of cameras, there's that slow motion setting, right? Well, the frame rate for that is probably 120. And so your shutter speed, double 120, is 240. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's just go ahead and go back down to what we were. I think I was at ISO 160 here, and then get my f-stop back down to 1.4. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now we're back at our normal settings here. My recommendation, if you're shooting video and you want that nice creamy blurry background, make sure in your camera settings you've got your frame rate set to where you want it and know what that is. So if it's 24 frames a second, you're gonna wanna go and change your shutter speed to 1/50. That's double the frame rate. That's what you're gonna want it to be. It's gonna give you that nice natural motion blur. So that's set, that exposure setting is set. Now we gotta deal with the other two. And those two are the ones that you kind of have to work in tandem based on whatever light rig you have going. If you're shooting outside, it's gonna be different than when you're shooting inside. Right now, I'm shooting with my curtains closed. I'm not using any natural light because it's raining, it's overcast, there's a lot of, the light is shifting and changing. So what I'm doing is I've got my backlight, this fill light right here, which is just kind of filling the side of my face. And if I turn that off, you'll kind of see how that changes. And then I've got my main key light right here, which is my ring light. So that's where all of my normal light is. And there's another fill light back here with the window, some natural daylight there. So it all depends on where you're shooting. And so my ISO right now is set to 160. I'm not super overexposed, I'm not super underexposed. Everything looks pretty well lit, I would say. I could probably use another light back here, just personal preference. And then my f-stop, my aperture, is set to 1.4. So that's where I'm getting my nice blurred out background. So everything is set pretty well. Let's just say hypothetically we gotta go outside. If you don't have an ND filter, you're gonna have to change your f-stop or your shutter speed. So having an ND filter when you're in the middle of a sunny day is gonna be super beneficial. But let's just say that you don't have an ND filter. You're gonna wanna have to change your ISO and your f-stop when you're in the middle of daylight. If you still want that blurry background, an ND filter is recommended, or you're gonna have to change your shutter speed. If you change your shutter speed, you're gonna start to get that really unnatural motion blur. It's gonna look a little weird. So I would recommend, if you are planning on shooting outside at times and you still want that natural blurry background, to get an ND filter. And that's what I'm actually using right now, just based on my personal setup. So just a quick overview. F-stop controls that aperture in your lens. So the lower your f-stop number, the more light is gonna be let into your camera lens. That means that aperture is much wider. The higher your f-stop number, so f-stop 4, 16, whatever, the less light is gonna be let in. And so that aperture is gonna close. And like I said before, if you think about it like the pupil of your eye, it's gonna be a lot easier to understand that. But once you do get the hang of it, once you do understand your f-stop and you go out to shoot inside or outside and you're adjusting those settings, both your f-stop and your ISO, it's gonna be a little bit easier to play around with, and you'll be able to get that shot that you want. The more practice that you implement, the more that you do it, the better you're gonna get at it. So I encourage you guys, don't use auto on your camera. Go to your manual settings, learn your settings, learn how to do it manually so that you can get the best shot that you want. So if you want to get that nice, creamy, blurry background and impress your family, make them think that you're a professional, or your friends, adjust that f-stop, get a camera lens that's got that lower f-stop so that you can shoot those nice, professional looking videos. But guys, that's everything that I have. I'm gonna link an article, a website below for you to go and just read and just more information. That's where I got a lot of this information from here. That's where I got that diagram from. And it's very helpful. It puts it into very easy, understandable terms. But if you're interested in and want to get better as a photographer and a videographer, it is important to understand those three pillars of your exposure, your aperture, your f-stop, and your ISO. And I encourage you, shoot in manual, do not shoot in auto. And then get out there and just try it. Just get after it, guys. Like, learn how to be really great at photography and videography. You can do it. I believe in you. Sorry guys, I feel like I can be a little awkward at times you have to figure out what to say in these videos, and you don't know what to say. Oh, anyways, I hope that this was helpful, and maybe if you kind of already knew a little bit about aperture and f-stop, that maybe this was a little bit more informative for you, or maybe you're a beginner at filmmaking and taking photos, and this was super helpful. I hope so. Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more videos just like this, I encourage you to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and then just hit me up down in the comments below. Any questions that you have, any recommendations, things that you guys want to see or learn, I'd love to be able to be a resource for you guys here. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this video, guys. Hope you guys have a great one, and we'll see you in the next video.